I'm not a witch at all. I'm Dorothy Gale from Kansas.
Hello. This video is going to be a deep dive into the Wizard of Oz and its relationship to some more traditional forms of magic or the occult. And I guess just to start, I'm gonna do the movie and not the book. I haven't read the book, just being completely honest with you. I think most people have only seen the movie. But yeah, so you talk about what you know. So anyways, The Wizard of Oz is a pretty magical film and follows many of the traditional steps found in initiation ceremonies all over the world. Now, these ceremonies can be about achieving enlightenment, acceptance into adulthood, but all of them sort of mark some sort of transitionary period. Once it happens, everything's different, even though it's all the same kind of idea. So, like any piece of art worth its weight, the characters in The Wizard of Oz play more archetypical roles, rather than taking on kind of individual personalities from their own time. It's how these characters look through the lens, not the lens itself, I guess. Within the story of The Wizard of Oz, there are 7 characters who really drive the plot, and these characters come in 2 pairs, and then a set of 3. So the 2 pairs are the Wizard of Oz himself and the Good Witch of the North, and then Dorothy and the Wicked Witch of the West. The set of 3 is the 3 companions who join Dorothy. So the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion.
No place for Dorothy around the pigsty. Now you go feed those hogs.
So in terms of the story, the order of the 3 companions is pretty important, and it actually is kind of representative of the form of the ritual, and it's seen a lot in, I guess, European stuff, honestly Japanese stuff as well, and then obviously it kind of has some older roots in some Vedic stuff, and then honestly there's a lot of Egyptian in there as well. So each one of the characters, Dorothy included, so Dorothy, the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and the Lion, each one of them represents one of the 4, I guess, primal elements, that being wind, earth, water, and fire.
Oh, you got my finger. Why don't you get your finger out of the way? There you are. Right on my finger. It's a lucky thing it wasn't your head.
And it's funny, but I feel as if I've known you all the time. But I couldn't have, could I?
Besides the companions representing the 4 elements, or I guess 3 elements with Dorothy, they also sort of show that Dorothy has entered a sort of mirror world, in that the 3 companions all want something that they actually demonstrate in the real world. So like the Scarecrow, he wants a brain, and before Dorothy enters the world of Oz, there's a scene actually where she's talking with him, and he's given her very sound advice, and he seems to be he's the brains of the operation, so to speak.
I just dropped by because I heard the little girl got caught in the big... Well, she seems all right now.
Yeah, she got quite a bump on the head. We kind of thought there for a minute she was going to leave us.
The beginning and the end, or just to spice things up a little bit, the alpha and omega of the story is Dorothy, who represents the element of air. As it's revealed in the end, the whole story takes place in the confines of Dorothy's mind, and it isn't until she realizes this that she's able to complete her journey. Now, I know that some people aren't a fan of stories where it was all a dream or it just takes place in their head, but I kind of think that's a little closer to reality, and I think the lesson there is that taking responsibility for what you think is very important, and kind of that's the major theme of the story. So in magic, the I guess you could say that Dorothy is representative of the Fool card, which is also associated with the element of fire. And so the Fool card is kind of said to represent a person with no preconceived ideas going on a journey. You know, they're a newborn baby, they're an absolute fool, and they'll kind of just take in whatever they'll see. And that's kind of true with Dorothy. She's very naive, kind of believes whatever. You know, she's a child. And when she enters, you know, Oz, she lets the wonderment take over her instead of kind of trying to fight the nonsense. And I think that's definitely something that can easily be forgotten, is she enters a world that she knows nothing about, and instead of trying to make sense of it and, you know, put her own world on top of it, which kind of happens, but rather she lets the journey actually happen. And another, you know, part of, you know, the wind is it's supposed to be a hidden active force, in that, like, it does affect the world and kind of shape things, but, you know, obviously in real life we can't see the wind, but we can only feel its effects, and that's kind of the idea there. And, you know, that lines up with, you know, the story's all taking place in Dorothy's head, so, you know, whatever she thinks is the reality. And so, you know, she is kind of this hidden guiding force the whole time, even if, you know, she's not aware of it.
Now look at Dorothy, you ain't using your head about, Miss Gulch. Think you didn't have any brains at all.
I have so got brains.
Well, why don't you use them?
The first companion that Dorothy meets along her way is the Scarecrow, who represents the element of Earth. So the obvious connection here is, you know, he's farming, so the link to the soil, stuff like that. But beyond that, you can also see a Scarecrow kind of as the salt of the earth. This link actually shows up in Don Quixote as well. The two main characters, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, have a similar relationship that, you know, Dorothy and the Scarecrow have. Being in that, you know, the main character, Don Quixote, kind of represents wind, the driving force behind the adventure, while Sancho, you know, the salt of the earth man, is kind of just being dragged along with it. And there's even a similar fate where the Scarecrow at the end of the story is turned into the King of Oz, because it's kind of this, like, you know, a ruler should come from the people idea, where how can you know their troubles if you haven't walked in their shoes? And so in Don Quixote, Sancho Panza actually becomes the governor, and despite, you know, everyone assuming he's a simpleton, an idiot, he's actually shown to be very, very good at ruling over a kingdom. You know, of course, it's a comical book, so Sancho stops being a governor because it gets in his way of eating food. But that's kind of he's the man. He is the people, so to speak, and, you know, he understands their plight. It's kind of the idea there. So this kind of actually contrasts with the Wicked Witch of the West herself, who quite literally presented as a tyrant. Dorothy apologizes to her people when, you know, Dorothy ends up killing the witch, and they all actually cheer. So, you know, it's this contrast between how disconnected the witch has become from reality versus, you know, the Scarecrow, who is, you know, right in the thick of things. He's on the fields. He's, you know, out there, you know, with the hay, so to speak. And one final kind of minor point on the Scarecrow is that, you know, Earth is said to be a passive force, and this can kind of be seen in how the Scarecrow ends up joining Dorothy. It's not that he decides he wants to join her. He jumps down and, you know, joins her, but Dorothy actually has to release him from his prison, so to speak, on the Scarecrow stake which the witch had placed him. So it's not through his actions that he joins, it's sort of Dorothy not really forcing it upon him, but Dorothy initiates.
All right, Mrs. Gale. But someday they're going to erect a statue to me in this town.
Well, don't start posing for it now.
The next character that Dorothy comes across is the Tin Man, and despite being made of metal and lacking a heart, he represents water. This character seems to become more and more important every day with the rise of computers and sort of these people of logic, so to speak. Obviously, logic is a very useful tool, that goes without saying, and without the ability to break things down into numbers and make sense of it removed from the world, there are plenty of things that we wouldn't be able to accomplish, create, or, problems to solve. But a big problem, especially today, with everyone thinks themselves a logic master, is when people start to mistake their emotional states for logic. This usually kind of shows up when a person just doesn't like an action someone's taken, so it becomes sort of a bad action that ultimately harms people or whatever, and it's kind of a tunnel vision, not seeing the big picture, but rather kind of microscopic on themselves, and so, I dislike it, so it must be bad, kind of thing. So, the Tin Man kind of provides an excellent example of this, where despite claiming to have no heart, because he's made of metal and hollow inside, he still cries very often, and this causes him to rust, which becomes a big problem for other people. So in a way, the Tin Man is jumping to a conclusion based on incorrect information, if that makes sense. It's not his metal body and hollow insides that really determines if he has a heart or not, but how he actually interacts with the world. The problem is that he's basically been basing the way he examines things on something completely wrong, and that's kind of where this comes into play, where it's faulty logic is faulty logic. It doesn't, just because it adds up logically doesn't really make it true, is kind of the thing. So, like Earth, water is also said to be a passive element, and it can again be seen in the way the Tin Man joins Dorothy and the Scarecrow. He is literally can't move. He's rusted, like in place, and it's not until the two of them use oil to loosen him up that he's able to actually come along. And he doesn't initially want to join them. That's when they tell him, oh, you could get a heart, that he decides, I'm going to come join. So, just kind of keeping in with the passive element. I guess also on that, the Tin Man and the Scarecrow are, earth and water, which are also meant to kind of represent more earthly things. And this can kind of be seen in their professions. The Tin Man is a lumberjack, and then obviously Scarecrow is a farmer, which these are common folk jobs. These aren't kings and queens or even lawyers or anything like that. It's just humble, normal people jobs, building homes and feeding the people.
Are you all right, Dorothy?
Yes, I'm all right. Oh, I fell in and see. Why, see, you're just as scared as I am.
The final member to join the group is the Cowardly Lion. Now, in contrast to the other two, the Cowardly Lion actually approaches the group first. He's kind of aggressive, and attacks them, trying to scare them away. Classic bully stuff where, because of his fear, he tried to, scare other people. But the final element, which he represents, is fire. And this kind of plays into his militant character, bravely charges into, head first. Of course, he's lacking that bravery, but at the end of the story, the wizard kind of tells him that bravery isn't a lack of fear, but the ability to have fear and then go and face it, which it's a pretty common thing, but I think a lot of people can mistake that, because people will say, oh, that's not bravery, that's stupidity, but that kind of is what bravery is a little bit. It's understanding that things might not or could not go well, but still choosing to do it anyways. Now, like how water and earth are linked, fire and air are linked as well, kind of air being the past, or air being almost like the hidden form of fire. And it can be said that, this whole issue that Dorothy had was because she had an issue with, a mean old lady. And the big problem in The Wizard of Oz is that they have to go and, take down the witch. Of course, it's, through the courage of the lion and then, him leading the other people that this is accomplished, as he almost becomes like the hand of Dorothy and starts kind of enacting her wishes upon the world. And this link between the two can actually be seen after they get dressed up in Oz. They both have bows placed in their hair. Dorothy's is blue and the lion's is red. And they'll kind of stand opposite of each other quite a bit, kind of pulling into the idea of like a king and queen, which isn't necessarily like a monarch thing, but more just like two halves of a whole.
By the priests of Isis and Osiris in the days of the pharaohs of Egypt, in which Cleopatra first saw the approach of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and...
So this is where things get a little bit more out there, and I'm gonna put a little graphic on the screen, pretty bad one at that I made, kind of trying to illustrate things. But if you place the cardinal directions of the elements, and then trace the path that Dorothy makes, she actually goes so anti-clockwise, or counterclockwise, depending where you're from, around the center, and then from the east to the west, and then down underground, and then back to where she started. And so this sort of pattern is the same as the Isis and Osiris story of how Osiris essentially dies, goes into the underworld, and then resurrects again and later, which is a pretty typical, it's a pretty typical story for kind of like a sun king or something like that, where it's, it's this idea of how nature works, where, something has to die and then essentially go through a dark phase, be reborn, and that's the only way it can come back, stronger, better. And they'll kind of mention this, a lot of the characters, when Dorothy, wakes up, they talk about thinking she was dead and stuff like that. And that's a little bit of, what's going on here. Is it's relating to the Osiris and, Isis myth, or really just, any number of the other versions of this myth, really.
How about a little fire, Scarecrow?
Now, for the characters more directly a foil to the to Dorothy is the Witch of the West, who's kind of presented just as your typical tyrant. She's kind of grown disconnected with the world around her and rules with an iron fist due to the dwindling grasp she has on her power. She's kind of forgotten, the source of her power, which, is the people. And again, this is shown when, when Dorothy apologizes to her subjects for killing her, and, they're very happy to see her gone. Something that is kind of interesting is the uses of water to defeat her, kind of due to the reflective nature of water. Remember, I guess, old Greek myth is Narcissus sees his reflection in a lake, and that's kind of where he ends up. So you can see this reflection kind of as a look at reality, and kind of seeing what you actually are, and kind of breaking free of delusion. As she's dying, the Wicked Witch kind of mentions that her beautiful wickedness is being destroyed. Now, maybe not exactly, but this is kind of a contradiction that she's built up. And, it's kind of only to herself that her wickedness comes off as beautiful. And so, like, I mean, beauty's in the eye of the beholder or whatever, but if if everyone else thinks you're ugly, it can only be delusion that you're calling yourself beautiful. There's also an association with flame for the witch, which might be kind of why water kills her. And she kind of sets the scarecrow on fire a few times. I don't really think there's kind of a higher meaning to this other than kind of just her destructive nature. And she does have green skin, which Osiris is a green-skinned ruler, and so I do think it kind of is just like her. You could even see her as like a dragon who's sitting in her lair, breathing fire at people constantly, and someone needs to free the people from the dragon.
Hold on to your heart, hold on to your hope. March up to the gate and bid it open.
She's crying. Someone has hurt her. Someone has just about broken her heart.
Me?
Well, it's someone she loves very much.
You don't need to be helped any longer. You've always had the power to go back to Kansas.
The two characters who are more minor, but maybe the most important of them all, are the Good Fairy of the North and the Wizard of Oz. The wizard actually appears to Dorothy before she arrives in Oz as a traveling huckster. The thing is, in the real world, he's a wise man who plays the role of a huckster to teach, while in the Wizard of Oz, or in the land of Oz, he's a huckster who kind of plays the role of a wise man. Again, when he first meets Dorothy, he mentions the Isis and Osiris myth, and I think in the land of Oz, him and the Good Witch can be seen as these two characters, him being Osiris, her being Isis. I think that the Wizard of Oz being the Wizard of the Emerald City is pretty important because the color of green is heavily associated with Osiris, and it's kind of meant to play in on the fertility of the land, and kind of how when Osiris is around, the world is fertile and it's good. So I guess the reason for this linkage between the two is that they both serve sort of as, I guess we can call it like a spiritual guide for the group. So the wizard, he kind of emboldens the men, whereas the Good Witch emboldens the women, or, well, just Dorothy. But both of them kind of have the same solution to their problems, and that solution is that they've had what they were looking for the whole time. They just kind of needed the confidence to actually act on it, I suppose. Now, the Good Witch is a little bit more magical, and that could play into some other stuff. But really, both of them, they work in tandem. The Good Witch sends them to the wizard, who then, teaches the group the same thing that the fairy was trying to teach them. A final point on the characters, and this is a bit further out there, is a possible link to Veles. Now, Veles is the Slavic god of magic and trickery. He's heavily associated with the earth and water and said to live underground. He is locked in a constant battle with Perun, who is the ruler of the sky, which, the witch has her flying monkeys that descend upon people. So I guess one of the reasons that I'm mentioning him is because he became associated with Santa Claus much later, and the two main colors throughout the story are, I guess besides yellow for Yellow Brick Road, but the Emerald City and then the ruby red slippers. So there is clearly, at least with the magical characters, so the wizards and the witches, there is this association with the same colors we associate Christmas with. And again, the Ra and Osiris myth, or Osiris and Isis myth, was said to occur in December, which is around the same time as Christmas. I guess with that said, the story that the movie presents is very interesting, It clearly borrows from older stories and builds upon them, or at least changes the lens that they're seen through. Do I think this is some sort of secret formula to achieve a higher form of being? You become Osiris. No, but I think something that is important about it is it kind of offers people the opportunity to take control of their own lives, and become Osiris to themselves. It really is about just the world is how you see it, and if you're willing to put the work in, so to speak, and think of things in a good light, that's how they'll come out. And again, Dorothy feels as though she's gone on a long trip, when the reality is she was kind of just, she was asleep the whole time. She was asleep and now she's awake, if that makes sense. And it really does just kind of come down to understanding and, I don't know, seeing that things are self-made.
Can I still have my dog?
No, fool that I am. I should have remembered.
And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, even if it doesn't really provide much insight. But I don't know. I think that there's a lot to be gleaned from these sort of fairy tales, and they're more humble form of storytelling, in that they let other people kind of take a turn, if that makes sense.